Hello, good evening, and welcome to Melo Live. Today, we are privileged to have with us in the studios virtually. We have Mr. Trevor Hambayi joining us, and today we are basically speaking about SME development. That's building back better. So, Mr. Hambayi is a financial analyst and currently a PhD fellow with the University of Boston. He advocates for the African continent's economic emancipation through improved access to finance for SMEs. He's a senior managing partner at Development Finance Associates, a social enterprise fund management company that supports social investment in startups, covering grants, debt, finance, and equity investment. Mr. Hambayi consults on matters relating to finance that includes investment, funding sources for business enterprises, financing models, economic stimulus, bond issuance, and private sector investments to economic growth. He is also a certified mentor coach with the Dutch-based Venture Capital for Africa and the USAID Support Mentorship Program. Mr. Hambayi has extensive global experience spanning over 30 years, both within the private sector, quasi-government organizations, which includes stints with the UN in a conflict zone, investments analysts with the US-based financial institution and consultancies, with aid organizations as well as industry-specific association in Zambia. Mr. Hambayi, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
It's always a pleasure to see you, and we want to express gratitude for being with us. And to get started with why we are here today. So the government has established the Ministry of SME. How do you see this helping SMEs in our country?
So the first thing that you see is that the SME sector has always been a government issue where they're mentioning that they're going to support the growth of the economy through the SME sector. And the establishment of the ministry is a very positive aspect, that it starts to define the government's seriousness towards having to support SMEs in the country. And we are hoping that the ministry will be very specific in having to deal with the issues that are affecting SMEs.
Oh, thank you very much. Before we continue, do you think there are enough enabling laws within the ministry to deal with such kind of initiative, whereas is concerned with the same formation of the ministry specifically for SMEs?
So in terms of the ministry, obviously it being a new ministry is that we do not know what regulations they are putting in place to ensure that they can effectively implement the strategies that are speaking to supporting SMEs. The specific issues that we know that SMEs are facing as a challenge is obviously access to finance. There are also issues around policy, that is a policy that directly speaks to supporting SMEs. And then there are issues also around having to be able to create a tax incentive that is supporting our local enterprises. Now, for the specific SME ministry that we do have, remember that the responsibilities that the SME ministry is going to take were initially being undertaken by different segments of line ministries within the government. That we had the Ministry of Commerce that was having to do these issues. We've also got obviously the Zambia Development Agency, which was also under the Ministry of Commerce. And there were some of the responsibilities that had been delegated to the Ministry of Youth and Sport, the Ministry of Education, as well as the Ministry of Higher Education. All those ones had work that was actually supporting SMEs. The cardinal issue that is going to come into place now is to ensure that we can create the right kind of collaboration between all these ministries for them to achieve the same goal under the Ministry of SMEs. This is not going to be easy because then the ministries themselves that we are asking to be able to work with the SMEs are losing some of the benefits and responsibilities that they had before, and this creates conflict within government professionals and the technocrats. So this is a very huge part that needs to be covered before we can actually see value to the Ministry of SME. But the Ministry of SME then also needs to clearly define what the agenda is. What is the SME development agenda do we have as a ministry, and how are all the other ministry partners going to support that agenda in achieving it?
All right. In case you've just joined us today on Melo Live, we are hosting Mr. Trevor Hambayi, who is a financial analyst. I'd like to let you know that we are live on our Facebook page as well as YouTube channel. So we encourage you to follow us so that every time we have such kind of discourse, you are notified and you don't miss anything. So Trevor, to continue, what are the really like SMEs challenges we need to resolve in order for us to build better?
So the first aspect that we must consider in having to build back better as a country, which is having to have our economy recover, is the fact that we want to drive economic recovery through the private sector. The private sector is constituted of 96% is SMEs. And this is a very key aspect in terms of how we approach the recovery, because we've had this before where our economy was growing between 7 and 9% between 2004 and 2014, but the benefits did not trickle down to the general masses. This is because that growth was being driven by foreign direct investors, and they externalized the resources. So in having to build back better is that what we need to do is that we want to ensure that the bigger proportion of the recovery is being driven by local enterprises. Now, what do we need to do to ensure that the local enterprises are the ones that are driving this? There are a number of things that come into play. The first one is a policy issue. And the policy issue is speaking to the Investment Act, that this is the only act that we do have that supports private sector. The Investment Act is, technically speaking, is that it provides incentives to multinationals that come into the country, which are your tax holidays, your rebates in terms of import duties, and the tax holiday in having to pay income tax. Is that we need to be able to give incentives to local SMEs that will allow them to be as competitive, to create an equal playing field for the SMEs to be able to compete with those foreign direct investors, which is the first one. The second one, obviously, is speaking to the issue of tax, is that currently the SME sector is paying a 4% turnover tax. Effective rate of a 4% turnover tax on a month is that it comes to 44% on an annual basis. This is the highest tax there is in the country. But also what it does is it takes away the income that the SMEs could have put back into their businesses for their business to grow, because they're paying it in tax on a monthly basis, which also disadvantages them with foreign entities. That is the second issue, that if we are talking about having to support the SMEs, we cannot be taxing them the highest rate in the country. We need to give them a break, an incentive for them to be able to grow their businesses. The third one is obviously access to capital, is that there is no capital for SMEs to access. Firstly, before you even start to talk about access to capital, is that there is no financial institution in this country that will finance a startup. You must remember, our population is 60% of youth who are below 35. So generally speaking, is that they are generally starting their own businesses. We've got 300,000 graduates that are being pushed onto the job market on an annual basis. And these ones now, without jobs on the market, are having to resort to going into entrepreneurship. So they are startups. But generally speaking, is that there's nobody who is going to finance them because of how our capital market is structured. This needs to be resolved, that we are able to find ways to be able to have liquidity that supports entrepreneurship and innovation of our youth, because this is where the future is, but also they constitute the major component of our private sector. So those are the three cardinal issues. And then once we come out of those issues, we want to look at the issue of liquidity in the market. What you do find is that government has continued to crowd out the private sector by borrowing the money on the capital market. Other than borrowing the money on the capital market, is that 60% of all the money that is on the capital market is borrowed by government in treasury bills and bonds. But additionally, government has also continued to increase their arrears, which is goods and services that are provided to them and for which they have not paid. Currently, that amount stands at 47 billion kwacha that government owes to the private sector. And most of those ones are SMEs. That 47 billion is $2.5 billion, which we're saying if government was going to dismantle this amount, pay the SMEs, is a very good way of starting to create liquidity for them to actually invest into the economy. Right now, we're actually stifling the private sector and SME. We are killing them because we have not paid them what is due to them. And then what you do find is that the financial institutions are posting a higher record of non-performing loans from the SMEs, but the SMEs have not been paid because of the situation that they've been put in by government's arrears position. And I think those are cardinal issues that we need to address before we come to having to discuss the issue around access to market.
All right. Thank you very much. You had touched on a very cardinal thing, the tax. Usually, definitely, we've seen other foreign investors coming who have tax holidays. They keep on changing names here and there. But, for example, if you had to realistically suggest in terms of the percentage or what kind of rate in terms of tax, what would you advise, for example, the government? What is the normal kind of tax we would use to tax the SMEs?
So there are two things that we can do. Firstly, is that what you do see is a situation where, as a country, I think we do have the resources that are supposed to go towards supporting SMEs. But we have not structured the right kind of financing models that are sustainable to ensure that the funds that we give SMEs is actually recovered. The ones that go through government is that we seem to lose all the money every time we try and do this. You hear of the empowerment fund, but then they turn into political issues where we have given out the money and under political mileage and we've lost the money. From a tax basis is that we want to create an equal playing field. Firstly, what you do see from the large organization is that they've got zero tax liabilities for the first 5 years. And this is the same that we must apply to our SMEs. And I actually think the conditions that we give our SMEs should be better than the ones we give foreign entities. So in having to build the country better from an SME perspective is that we want to be able to incentivize employment creation. And we'll say that for every SME that creates 3 formal jobs, we will give you a tax rebate and you only have 1% tax to pay. If you get to 5 formal jobs, then you get to 0. You're not paying any tax. In true sense, government is not going to lose any revenue. Yes, you're not going to tax the company in terms of income tax, but the company will still continue to pay on pay as you earn because of the formal jobs that they have created on a monthly basis, which is at 30%. So you are still creating greater value for government in government revenue, but providing incentives to the businesses for them to be formal and create formal jobs. So which is the first thing that I see in terms of tax? If anything, if nothing else happens, we need to have an equal playing field, which then says that the tax base that the SMEs pay must be the same as everybody else, which is at 30%, because the tax base in the 2022 budget was reduced for the large organizations from 35% to 30%. if you're going to tax the SMEs, it must either be equal to this, or you must support the SME and reduce to a rate that is lower than this. And I propose that firstly, it must be up to 5 years of zero tax, but it must be aligned to you having to create specific formal jobs where you're actually paying your pay as you earn on a monthly basis for the jobs that you have created.
All right, thank you very much. Viewers, in case you've just joined us, today we are hosting Trevor Hambayi, who is a financial analyst, and we are talking about SME development, building back better. So as we continue, Trevor, access to finance is one of the biggest challenges for SMEs. Government has allocated 350 million to SMEs. Is this amount sufficient, and how will it be disbursed?
So the 350 million kwacha that was allocated in the 2022 budget for SME development is a very positive one. But there are considerations that we must make. Firstly, is that we must define as a country what it is that we want to achieve. And that which we want to achieve is then we have to determine what are the resources that are required to do this. If we're just talking about $350 million, 350 million kwacha, it's a very small amount of money. It is insufficient. If you look at our capital market in terms of where it is, we have got around $3.2 billion in revenue that is available for the financial institutions to lend out. 60% of this amount is borrowed by government in treasury bills and bonds. An additional 27% to 30%, the financial institutions are lending it out to payday loans, which is basically they're providing consumer lending for consumption. That if you've got you are a full-time employee and you have got a salary, you can borrow against this money for whatever you use it. There's only 10% that is remaining for the private sector to borrow in terms of putting into the productive sector. And of that 10%, 80% is again taken by the large corporates who have got a better relationship in terms of risk mitigation with the financial institutions. Then we remain with around 2 to 3% that actually goes to the SMEs. This is insufficient. The alternative funding, which is the 350 million kwacha, is then firstly, we have gotten to the beginning of the year. We still do not know how this 350 million is going to be disbursed. Is it going to be concessional funding? Is it going to be commercial funding? Or this is just going to be a grant? We need to create a sustainable model that is speaking for government to be able to recover this, because we cannot continue to be just borrowing money from government and throwing it away. And then there's an additional amount, which is even a larger amount, which is speaking to the SMEs, which is the 884 million kwacha that is in the CDF. In the CDF, there is around 6 million kwacha for every constituent to be able to support the SMEs, youth and women in the different constituencies. And what I would have expected is this was the first hanging fruit for the SME ministry, for them to design a criteria under which these funds are going to be disbursed by every constituency. They would have given this guideline to be so that it is standard. It is allowed for. We know exactly what is happening, and they are able to report back to the Ministry of SME, and the SME ministry will then be able to tell the country what every constituency is doing and consolidate this information, because this is where the beginning of having to develop our country, especially in the rural areas. And I expect that the SME will provide this guideline, other than the ones that are talking about that they want to do financing. The SME ministry has got no capacity to be working towards having implementation. They need to work with partners, especially private sector partners, to implement the financing programs and ensure that they are receiving the necessary reports that are speaking to actually developing our country through supporting SMEs.
Thank you very much. And as we go on again, Trevor, in relation to that, of course, what is the contribution of SMEs to employment, poverty reduction, and GDP in general in our country?
So it's a universally accepted empirical evidence that suggests that the growth of any country's economy has always been driven by the SME sector. And this is the same principle that has been applied by emerging economies. China, Malaysia, India, all of them have used the SMEs to grow their economies. Right now in the US, they'll give you statistical evidence in terms of numbers as to how many jobs have been created on a monthly basis. If you look at that information, you'll find that 70% of all the jobs that were created by those companies on a monthly basis in the US were created by SMEs. Now, which is the first thing, is that the SMEs is the biggest strategy that we have towards having to resolve our unemployment challenge, which is the first thing. And the reason this happens is that there are a lot of the number of SMEs that are so many is that, yes, they employ small numbers, but when you consolidate them together, it becomes a very large number. It is also evident in our employment statistics right now. If you look at our employment statistics, we are around 900,000 in formal employment. Of that 900,000 in formal employment, a very big component, which is around 68%, are jobs that are being provided by SMEs. And this is a very important aspect that we must be able to do this. So we need to support them if we really want to resolve our employment issue. In terms of poverty reduction, what you do find is that the SMEs are the entities that have got businesses and entities that are at the grassroots. They are the ones that are working with the people, the poorest of the poor in our economy. They are the ones that have got businesses that are in the rural areas where our highest poverty levels are. And you do find that the small SMEs are the ones that go to buy our crops from the farmers in the villages, and then they trade them on in the urban areas. So it is very important that we support these SMEs because they are also the ones that are speaking to directly having to reduce the poverty levels within our country. And the third one is that we do have a challenge that the productivity that we have at the moment of SMEs is insufficient to contribute, is lower in terms of contribution to our GDP than the multinationals. There are 240 multinational companies in the country that contribute 68% to our GDP. The other 32% is being contributed by the rest of the country who are SMEs. So you can see the anomaly that a very small proportion, less than 3% of the private sector is contributing 68% to our GDP, and those resources are being externalized. And that is the biggest challenge that we need to be resolving in terms of ensuring that we drive the recovery of the country through the SME, because this is the best way that we can ensure that the resources remain in the country.
Thank you very much, Trevor. And finally, Trevor, how do we ensure that SMEs play a major role in the economic recovery of the country, and why?
So the first reason why we want the SME to play a major role is that we want to achieve specific goals as a country. You know that, firstly, from our seventh National Development Plan, our SDG 2030, and as well as our agenda, which is Vision 2050, is that it all speaking to the economic emancipation of the African continent. As a continent, we need to be able to achieve economic independence. And this we can only do it through the Africans, through the local people, through domestic investment. And the reason we have had such a big challenge in our country is that now we have got an issue where we are trying to recover, to increase the revenue we generate from copper mining, but we have not been able to do this because it's being driven by foreign entities. If you look at any sector in our economy, All the major players are foreign entities, whether you're looking at mining, whether you're looking at wholesale and retail, whether you're looking at ICT, whether you're looking at tourism, or you're looking at construction. All the major players are foreign entities, which is externalizing all our resources. And that's why we continue to have pressure on our exchange rate, because the resources are being externalized. If these businesses were local, they would have no reason to externalize the resources. We would have a greater stability in our macro economics in terms of our exchange rate and our reserves, because the resources will be here, and it will mean that the exchange rate will remain stable. So the strength and purpose of our economy is standing on who is driving it, and we want this to be local.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Well, viewers, that's what we had today for you. And just a quick one, we were hosting Trevor Hambayi today, who is a financial analyst, and we were basically talking SME development, building back better. Trevor, we want to thank you very much for your time, and I think we should have another session continuing with this same kind of topic, because there's so much we cannot cover within 30 minutes. So we'll look forward to seeing you again, Trevor, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to be back soon.